This week on the WriterCon podcast.
Sit down and actually write. So let's talk about it, do it. There's a lot of times that you have to spend thinking about your story or how you're going to crack something. You're raking the leaves, and that's productive time. But nothing beats getting your butt in the chair, putting your fingers on the keyboard, and actually putting something on the page.
Welcome to WriterCon, a gathering place for writers to share their knowledge about writing and the writing world. Your hosts are William Bernhardt, best-selling novelist and author of the Red Sneaker books on writing, and Lara Bernhardt, award-winning author of the Wantland Files book series.
Hey there, writers. Greetings from me and Lara and our sound engineer, Jesse Ulrich. Spoiler alert. This is a very special episode of the WriterCon podcast. No, we're not doing an after-school special, but we are doing something kind of, sort of, that I've been working on for a long time, and that, of course, is finding a Star Trek-related guest for Jesse for the podcast.
Yes.
I mean, maybe even someone you haven't met on all those cruises. Who knows? I tried. Patrick Stewart is on tour for his new book, but I couldn't get him.
No.
William Shatner has a new book, every 3 weeks or so, but I couldn't get him. But I do have the wonderful Dan Martin, who has worked on, I've been a writer in many fields, including the gaming field, and has recently worked on Star Trek Resurgence, the hit video game. And most importantly, he's had his picture taken with Jonathan Frakes. That's Commander Riker. Will that do, Jesse? Is this your dream guest?
I mean, I wouldn't say like it's my dream guest, but it's pretty great. I'm pretty happy about it. So.
Okay, who would be the dream guest?
Well, again, like either one of the two writers who make up James S.A. Corey from the Expanse series, of course, Brandon Sanderson. So, who does have his own podcast. I feel like even though he's super busy, I bet I can make it happen if I tried. So, I'll see what I can do.
Okay, work on that.
I'll get on the forums.
Well, offer a swap. Tell him you'll be on his podcast. He'll come on ours.
Perfect.
What about you, Lara? Do you have a dream guest?
Well, we've been watching the new Doctor Who.
This is true.
Would say
you went David Tennant because he's so cute.
Oh God, yeah. I mean, I figured I was trying to keep it in like the writing space. If we're just talking about dream guests of all time, like for anything. Yeah, let's get David Tennant on the podcast. He's delightful.
He also had a podcast during the lockdown when he had nothing else to do.
What a great show that his lockdown with his buddy. I can't remember the other actor's name, but that show was great. So I rewatched that recently, actually, just because.
Well, if we wanted to keep it within the writing space, maybe Davies. He writes some of our favorite episodes, I think, of Doctor Who.
Oh,
that'd be pretty great.
Russell T. Davies. Oh,
yeah. Sorry.
Sorry, I was
RTD for the insiders. There.
RTD.
Yeah.
Not
Stephen Moffat. I want Stephen Moffat on the podcast. That guy is hilarious.
Yes. Another good
one. He's so Scottish and angry all the time. He's great.
That's my dream guest. I want the Scottish angry guy on the podcast.
So great.
But instead, actually, this is much better. Our interview today is with Dan Martin, who is an LA-based writer and narrative designer with extensive experience in world building and story development. In other words, he writes stories for video games, an industry which, by the way, is now bigger than Hollywood. We had a game writer on the podcast at least once before, I remember, but it's been a while, and we've never had anyone who did anything for Star Trek. So this is going to be spectacular. Dan has worked on games from many franchises. In fact, as you will hear, he's done Batman and The Walking Dead, but now it's Star Trek Resurgence, a game getting fantastic reviews for its writing, and a game which I, despite my complete lack of video game skills, have actually played. Okay, halfway through, but still, that's better than most. We will talk to Dan in considerable detail about the opportunities for writers in the gaming world. But first, the news. Jesse, take us away. Our first story actually dovetails nicely with all this talk about Star Trek and media and whatnot, because this is basically me reporting on many other reports that the book to movie market is really heating up. Some people think it's because the lockdown is over and people are going back to the thriller, go back to the movie theater is what I meant to say. Or some people think it's because the strikes are over, so more projects are going into production. But one reason or another, we're seeing a big uptick in book to movie deals, which is why I've been posting some information about how to make that happen on the WriterCon Facebook page, which you might want to join if that interests you. We saw Universal close a deal after a big auction for an action thriller, which is, get this, based on a 43-page short story called Run for Your Life. There's also a preemptive purchase for a book called Safe House and a bunch of others. But the short story, there's another short story by Aaron J. that's going to be produced by Todd Lieberman, something, big money. And of course, the biggest deal one is the biggest book out there, Britney Spears' new memoir, The Woman in Me, which Lara and I talked about this, released at the same week as Barbara Streisand's new memoir, which you would have thought would be the Titan, but no, it's the number 2 book behind Britney Spears. And there are so many people circling around this property that everybody wants it. They don't know. It could become a TV series. It could become a feature film. It could be a documentary about her and the Free Britney movement and all of that. And nobody really knows. Lara, you think this is a flash in the pan, or you think we'll see more books made into movies and TV shows?
I'd like to see them continue to draw more from books. I think some of my favorite works, I very often see in the credits that it initiated from a book. It's based on a book. I think we just get so much character and stronger stories in adaptations from books. Mm-hmm. It's kind of already there for them. I think we just get a lot more emotional content in those movies.
Well, if you were picking, which one of your many published books would you like to see made into a movie?
Into a movie? Mm-hmm. Probably Shadow of the Taj.
Because?
I think that one would just lend itself well to cinematic treatment. It is a very... Files series would be a nice little Netflix series. That would be fun. I don't think... I mean, you could make it into a series of movies instead, but I think that would be fun as a...
Yeah, Shadow of the Taj. Well, it's serious, but it's also got a thriller story. I think that'd be a terrific movie. Jesse, what book would you like to see made into a movie?
Well, I've been saying this for years, and going back to people we'd like to have on the podcast, Neil Stephenson.
I thought it was going to be George R.R. Martin for sure.
No,
what do I know?
He has a trilogy of books. They're sort of about the history. It's sort of like a it's a fictional way of telling you like the history of science, like the beginning of mathematics and the modern economy via a fictional story where you're following around 3 different people, one of whom was like Isaac Newton's best friend. It would make a great HBO Max miniseries or Netflix show, because it's got a lot of wild characters and great locations, and also teaches you something secretly, as all of his books tend to do.
Nice.
Wait, whose books are we talking about? Who?
Neil Stephenson.
Oh, those are like 1,000 pages long, right?
Yeah,
thicker than the Bible.
Yeah, I listen. If I read something under 300 pages,
seasons of a Netflix series.
Yeah, listen. People need content. People need content.
So, okay, news story 2, which of course involves Amazon, but this time I shouldn't say it, that sounds awful, but in a positive light, because Amazon has brought suit against spammers and scammers, which are unfortunately all over the place in the book world right now. Anyway, Amazon announced that it's filed an actual honest-to-God lawsuit in California against more than 20 people who were scamming authors by, they send, usually it's an email that claims that they have some affiliation either with KDP, where self-published people upload their books, or Amazon Publishing, which is their traditional publishing branch. And then the scammers run fake Amazon websites, or they create knockoff websites to lure people into ultimately paying a fee to get published. And then, they get substandard work or no work at all. How many times can we say this on the podcast? Do not pay anybody to publish your book. If they want money, I don't care whether they call it an advertising fee or what. If they want money before they'll publish your book, they are not a real publisher. Okay. Lara, how do we stop these people who are ripping off all our friends?
It's ubiquitous. With the best thing we can do is just keep getting the word out there. Keep saying, what you just said, don't send people money. Really, really do your research. This applies to everything. I watch a guy on YouTube whose grandmother was sadly caught up in a scam. And he now has made it his life goal to clap back at these scammers. So when something hits his inbox or he gets a phone call from someone, he turns it around. He actually scams scammers. It's pretty brilliant. And I think all we can do is just keep encouraging people to be very smart about it, ask around. If something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Shoot, someone I know that I work with just told me that they got taken in by, they purchased something on Facebook and it just never showed up. They take your money and go. You've got to, it's a hard lesson to learn, but you've got to be careful.
Okay, go with me on this. This could be the plot of Saw 11, I'm thinking. Because the pattern is somebody does something to Jigsaw and then he exacts hideous revenge, right? Okay, so first, he's written his memoir, and who wouldn't want to read that?
Oh no, I'm getting behind this.
And they either don't publish it or, no, let's have scammers rip him off. And then, of course, he has to exact his revenge. I think we've got a horror film. Jesse, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's one where everybody wins. So, you torture those scammers. I'm not going to feel bad for him.
That's the thing. He's going to have our sympathy from the get-go, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's a good like twist on the normal Saw story where we don't feel bad. We dislike him. In this case, we love him. He's doing what we call street justice.
Yeah, yeah. I think we got something, guys. Somebody make a note.
Trademarked internet. That's ours. That's ours now.
That's all it takes on the internet, right?
Just scream trademark, copyright, trademark.
Sure. All right, Jesse, cue up the music. Let's talk to Dan Martin. And welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you for being here. This is terrific. Okay, traditional first question. If you could offer writers one piece of advice, one above all others, what would it be?
Sit down and actually write. So let's talk about it. Do it. There's a lot of times that you have to spend thinking about your story or how you're going to crack something. You're raking the leaves, and that's productive time. But nothing beats getting your butt in the chair, putting your fingers on the keyboard, and actually putting something on the page.
Dan, it is terrific having you on this podcast. I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time because I've been following your work for a long time. I know you did some writing before gaming. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I went to USC Film School for their production program, which is not their producing program, but it covers every aspect of filmmaking, television, sound, cinematography, editing, writing. And sort of as I got through that process, I realized the kind of stories I wanted to tell were too big for me to make at that point in time. Probably still too big for me to make on my own. So I wanted to write some big stories. And that's where I ended up going, kind of focusing down from every piece of filmmaking down to writing. And I worked in story development in Hollywood for a while, reading scripts, and sort of the other things that go along with it, like driving hard drives from one post house to another. But eventually, I wanted to focus on telling my own stories, so I spent some time working on my own writing. And randomly, I just got an email from one of my film school classmates' cousins, I think it was. It was at a game studio that needed writers, and the apocryphal story, perhaps, is that they had over 1,000 applicants for 2 positions because they'd had this massive hit. They were expanding, and they had no way of actually sifting through that, in any reasonable fashion. So they just turned to personal networks, and that's how I ended up on an email list that they reached out. I sent them some writing material, and they kept bringing me back for interviews. And the next thing I knew, I was driving up to the Bay Area to start my new career in
That's
writing for games.
Wow.
But of course, you've done the work, which is what Lara and I often say at conferences. You can't have a good break unless you've done the work first, right? You had some writing to show.
Yes, I had a portfolio of scripts, and I also had spent a lot of time reading scripts. I was a professional reader writing screenplay coverage, which is a synopsis as well as a critique of the script for the studio executives who don't want to read them just yet. I'm sure they obviously read them eventually, right? Of course, all the way through from start to finish in that order. But we give them the executive summary and say whether it's worth giving another read. And it's kind of hard to think that some fresh out of college or film school 20-something is the first and sometimes last line that you have to get through. But
it could be.
That's the way it was. At least it's not AI yet.
Yet. But I think there are already reports that Random House and other New York publishers are using AI to sift through manuscripts. So that'll be a hot minute. Anyway, so you mentioned that you got into this gaming. Now, is that Telltale Games or is that something before Telltale?
That's Telltale Games, which was about 10 years ago, a little over that. So I get to say I've been in here for a decade.
There you go. I remember when those games first started coming out. Actually, my youngest, Ralph, showed me the Walking Dead game, and I think his pitch, there's more to it, but his pitch was basically, look, Dad, you just choose from a menu what they're going to say. Even you can do this, Dad, is what he was saying, basically. Of course, as it turned out, there was a lot more to that. But I do feel like you guys at Telltale sort of developed a new kind of video game that was more accessible to, non-professionals like myself.
Yeah, and that's actually, it is a pitch that I give people when I'm trying to get them to play these games. I say it's not, you don't need the same kind of spatial awareness. There's a little bit of it that goes on, but a lot of it is just deciding what you're going to say to people and how you're going to navigate relationships and how you're going to make a big choice about, life or death situations or moral quandaries. And that's something that to some degree we all know how to do because we live in the world. We develop relationships here. So it was Telltale Games. This was the expansion of the company right after the first season of The Walking Dead came out. And they really did develop something that felt very new there. There are some other games that are similar that were concurrent, but it really crystallized things in this relationship gameplay as well as these moral questions that actually got taught in some high school civics and philosophy classes, as I understand it. It was a model of
that's impressive.
The trolley problem, basically, in many different formats.
Well, there were at least 2 Walking Dead games, right?
Yep.
And a Batman game I recall starting, but it was too hard for me. and the wolf in the title, the one that's based on a comic book series, but I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the title.
Okay. So I wrote on The Wolf Among Us, which was
The Wolf Among Us, yes. That was good.
It was based off the Fables comic book by Bill Willingham, which was recently he declared it public domain to get out of his contract. Or rather, he couldn't get out of his contract with DC Comics, so he declared it public domain so that anybody could use the underlying.
Interesting.
Or they can try. I think DC Comics has a different take on the subject, but
at the same time, it's based off of fairy tales, so it's kind of in the public domain anyway. And And then, I wrote for 2 Walking Dead games, season 2 and season 3, and their Batman game, and their season 2 of that. And then somewhere in the middle, I worked on their Game of Thrones game, which was very much the hot property at the time, and something else.
No kidding. And
I became a fan of as I was working on, which doesn't always happen.
Well, you probably have to immerse yourself in the mythology to write the game, and there's probably no mythology on Earth bigger than Star Trek, right? At this point in time, like over 600 hours of Star Trek programming, I read somewhere.
Over that, yes.
Were you already? So this we're now talking about your newest game, Star Trek Resurgence. Were you already a huge fan, or like you're talking about, did you become a fan as you worked on the game? And then if you did not, I suppose either way, did you then have to submerge yourself in the lore and this extensive world that exists out there now?
Well, I was definitely a fan long before this was even on the horizon. So I remember watching it at 7 p.m. on channel 56 in the Massachusetts area, where it was in first run syndication, sold to 300 individual markets in the 80s and 90s. And then I watched the movies, I watched the original cast movies. Then sort of when DVDs became available and you could get them a whole season on Netflix, I started going through everything start to finish. And I did that. Mm-hmm. And it was funny because we actually talked about Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, these 3 decision-making pieces of kind of one brain, if you will, as a model for how we would build our choices in a lot of the games that we did before Star Trek even came up, because you've got Spock pulling on the logic, McCoy pulling on your heartstrings, and then Kirk somewhere in the middle in this third way. And that's kind of how we would always look at making these choices, because you don't want it.
Brilliant.
It's not just yes, no, maybe. There have to be these shades, particularly if you're going to make over 100 of these choices over the course of a game. It can't just all be the same thing. You have to really have a science around making the choices. So I was well aware of it, but then I went through everything a couple of more times over the course of preparing to make the game, and then making the game. I usually had Star Trek on in the background while I was writing. I know that some people might say, "Hey, why are you're writing with TV on in the background?" But some people listen to movie soundtracks. Some people have the sound of the ocean. For me, sometimes it's nice to have, particularly when you work with a licensed IP, have that IP or something similar to it in the background. Sometimes you might pick up a word or a phrase that you're like, yes, that's exactly what I need for this specific moment in this specific world.
Bill, you're right. I guess all good writing comes from Star Trek. You talked about this in your writing process, and here's Dan supporting it. One of my tween birthdays, I won't give away. Someone might calculate my age from that, but that's what I did. We got the first 3 movies on tape, because that's what we had back then. And I had a Star Trek themed birthday, and the girlfriends I invited over for the sleepover, and I felt very wicked because we stayed up very late watching those. We were living it up.
Certainly if you watched number 1, because that's a pretty long one.
We were a little confused.
Or seems that way anyway.
Yeah.
So Dan, does this mean you were, what would that be? One of maybe 10 or 15 people on Earth who have written dialogue for Spock?
The number might be bigger than that, but it certainly felt special because
it seems special to me. Yeah.
We were able to cast a phenomenal voice double for the role.
He is dead on.
And he, we listened to hundreds of auditions and some big name voice impressionists in that world, and he was the only one that we could even really consider. He was the only one that was anywhere close, and Piotr Michael is his name. He did the voice doubling for George Carlin in the last Bill and Ted movie. This is his stock and trade. He does voice acting of sort of a general variety, but also he's known for voice doubling, and he's a technician about it. He's talked about, Leonard Nimoy had dentures at this point, and that affects the way you talk in this way. And Leonard Nimoy was grew up in East Boston, but he was trying to cover that. So that's why certain vowels sound a certain way, and why he says sensors, and because he's trying to cover for sensors and senses. The sensors are reading some magnetic interference.
English isn't Spock's first language, I assume, right?
Yes.
So
The in-universe, yes, that is. Well, he is half human, so it might be. His mother might have been speaking English in him in his crib.
Okay, while we're talking this, let's just get down to it. I know, Laura, you want to talk about writing and stuff, but this is Star Trek. So, okay, I was playing your game. I really loved it. Then we got to the tricorder stuff. That was harder, but I managed it. And then we got to a shooting scene. And I'm like, there has never been a shooting scene in the history of Telltale. And of course, ultimately, I just texted our son, Alan, and said, Alan, come get me through this. And he did. And then I could get through the rest of the game.
Oh, you should have texted me. There's a story mode so that it makes it easier, at least, where when you can
retry. I'm already on that, Dan.
Okay. All right. Well, it's funny because I think that as a group, video game fandom yearns for innovation in the method of interaction. Mm-hmm. And it's something that we wanted to bring sort of more of those video game elements into the Star Trek game than a lot of the Telltale games had before, because there were a lot of criticisms over the course of the Telltale the history of Telltale from Walking Dead forward, that the games weren't really changing a lot. And to me as a writer, I think they're totally different stories. It's like saying you want a television show to not be a television show, like that having a television show with completely different characters and a completely different structure isn't enough. But that's the way that video game fans oftentimes look at what is new in the game, not what's new in the story. So we wanted to bring more of these interactions in, stuff that we hadn't done before in the Telltale games. And in fact, over the course of those sort of the decade from the release of The Walking Dead season 1 and the eventual collapse of Telltale games, they were doing generally less of those sort of gameplay moments and doing more of the story gameplay, which as a writer I'm fine with, but that was a common criticism, that it didn't have those tactile moments or the game in the game.
But of course, that's what made the story stronger, because the story was continuous instead of, okay, now let's take a 2-hour break while you shoot through all these bad guys on the island. Or I'm not talking about Star Trek now,
of course not,
in general.
Yeah. No, and I think that one of the things that we did want to do in Star Trek Resurgence was make sure that we, for the most part, didn't drop you into one of those sections that went on for too long. We looked at it like an action sequence in a movie or a TV show. Like, how long do you want us to step away from the dialogue driven part of the story and go into a different mode? Because it's the same thing. We wanted mystery that you get to investigate. We wanted action. We wanted romance. We wanted some exploration, and we tried to give little bits of all these other side dishes outside of our main course.
No, I thought the story was terrific and very Star Trek. And of course, it's what you're talking about right now, the fact that there aren't a lot of tactile moments constantly that keeps the story rolling and makes it. I watch that same son play video games sometimes because I'd much rather watch than have to do it. But sometimes, because there's so much going on, you kind of lose the sense of the story, but not in your games.
Okay. Yeah, we do a lot of time, we play through them and we see where does it slow down, the same way that you do with a script or a book. You start seeing where your own eyes are glazing over, where we have outside people play tests, and it's all about, particularly this type of game, it's about keeping forward momentum so that we actually modeled it after what I call like an airplane novel, where you buy something at Hudson Books and you want to read the whole thing until you land, and you're not even standing up when the plane gets on the ground. You want to read the whole thing. Like my dad says, he wants to keep people up past their bedtime. There were people that were tweeting saying, I started playing, I was going to play for an hour, And our structure in the game is alternating chapters for two different POV characters. And when you do that right, you get to the end of a chapter and it's got a little cliffhanger and you say, oh man, I kind of don't want to go to that other POV because I want to stay with this story. But then the other POV does the same thing and it just keeps pushing you forward. And that's, for me, it's all about the story, the narrative experience that we take you on. We get to put you in the world.
Interesting. You're sort of describing what we go through with novels of having kind of the editing process and beta readers. You have beta players, right? You have people who are giving you that feedback. So what does your writing process look like? I feel like there's some people who maybe they wouldn't really understand exactly what it is that you do. What does your day look like as a writer?
Well, it depends on the project. So, there's the video game side of it, which is most of what I've done, but I've also, I write screenplays and television pilots. And I also wrote a comic book for Star Trek Resurgence, and I wrote a podcast, narrative podcast for the video game Halo.
Okay.
And they're all kind of contrasts in style, but for the video game world that I do for the most part, it starts with having that idea that generally when you're working with licensed IP, you've got to pitch to the IP holder, and there are things that are certainly understood, like the world of Star Trek. But then you could bring new characters in. Are you reviving some old alien civilization, which we did in the game? You have to pitch that. We do a story break session with all the kind of the stakeholders, whether it's on the IP side, on our side, and then it's not all that different from writing something linear, except for something like this. You just have to remember all these moments where you say, this is where you're going to have a big choice, and kind of bold it so it stands out in your outline. Say, this is going to be a big choice, and we're going to have to follow this. And then where it's relevant, you kind of have to have those side by side in your outline document. And eventually it goes from that phase where you've got your big picture of the story, and it starts getting really left brain for a while, where we have this flow charting tool, and every company that does this generally has their own proprietary tool. There are some that are available to commercially, where it's here's a little chunk of content, and you click on it and there's the script on the side, and then you say, okay, this is a set of choices, and then these are the chunks of content that follow the choice, and then this is down the line you'll have a thing that says, okay, this next part, check that choice back there and split this off, because it'll be different in each of these three scenarios, because you can remember and recall any decision that the player made. And then it's
all these different branching. I'm so sorry, but this is so intriguing to me, with all these different branches and options and things. So a novel probably will land somewhere between 80,000, 90,000 words. Sci-fi fantasy can be a little longer. We're talking about averages. What about for you? What does a game project look like? Do you know what's your final word count with all those different story branches going off in different directions?
So I don't actually have a word count for it, but what our scripts output in screenplay format, and it just stacks every piece of content on top of itself. So this game was over 1,400 screenplay pages, which if you compare it to a 46-page script for an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, it's more than a single season of Star Trek: The Next Generation, which is 24, 26 episodes. So it's
a lot. That's kind of
sizable.
What I was.
Yeah. Well, I'm intrigued by, you're talking about sending your work out. I mean, we send novels to maybe 10 beta readers, but they're all getting the same manuscript. Whereas in your case, different play testers could take the game off in completely different directions. So you must need like 1,000 play testers.
Well, strangely, that's kind of what happens when the game releases. So there is an element of it where in the first 24 hours that the game was released, there were probably more playthroughs by consumers than there had ever been by everybody making the game, because internally we have what's known as a QA tester, quality assurance, that will play the game, and they'll do it kind of on a a map, they have these plans to make sure they hit as much as they can through multiple playthroughs, and they follow the big choices. They try to hit everything as the versions come out, just to make sure nothing really unexpected shows up. But it's just kind of impossible to account for every choice that people can make in every possible combination, and I'll get to that later. But also B, there's a lot of different computer builds out there, so what an Xbox or a PlayStation hardware is going to be, but the options for a PC are also almost infinite. So there will always be a surprise. I think the biggest thing is it does rely a lot on the creatives behind the scenes to just know everything inside and out, like to know what happens in each of those 1,400 pages, so that you keep, because as much as the computer program can map things and is necessary for writing it and playing it, the program doesn't know what's important. So when you get to a point that you say, this is relevant to something that happened before, you have to remember that it's relevant and program in, okay, go look at that and tell me what they did there so that we can build off of that.
Dan,
our son Alan is actually beta testing DLC content for a very established, well-known game, but he had to sign a non-disclosure agreement. So I don't think I can even mention what
it's okay.
But
it's funny.
It's this idea that, like you said, people have to play through it and make sure he reports back if he has any snags or if it doesn't work properly, and he gives them feedback on what his play experience is like. So I'm fascinated with it. I think it's brilliant.
Yeah, you said the right word, player experience. It's very different than kind of even the audience experience, because it's the player is really a part of it, and we're always thinking about what is the player investing and how does this change the way the player is managing information in their own head. Because for all the things that we can call back to with our technology, the biggest and best tool we have is making the player think something's important, and usually it is, sometimes it's not, but they're always wondering about it, like what's going on behind the scenes for these other characters based on what I've said, and what changes about their understanding of the character based on what they said. Even if it doesn't specifically get called back to later, it changes that map in their head of the world of the story.
Yeah. Dan, you mentioned a minute ago your father, so I assume it's going to be okay if I inform everyone that
Absolutely.
your dad is the extremely well-known best-selling author William Martin, who's been on this podcast before, and it has keynoted at WriterCon as well. We need to get you out to WriterCon.
Absolutely.
That would be a blast.
Good.
You mentioned how video games or computer games have evolved just in the decade or so you've been working on them. Where do you think it's going in the future?
Well, it's interesting because it's bifurcating in a lot of ways, because there's consoles are getting more and more powerful and getting closer and closer to sort of this simulation of the real world. I've seen demos out there where you can't tell that it's in engine. It looks like somebody's carrying a camera around the real world. It's fascinating. And then on the other hand, half of the games industry is on mobile phone. So
is that right? Wow.
So there's half of the games are made for mobile phone, which they're great little devices. They're more powerful than your Nintendo was. They're more powerful than my probably computer 2 generations ago was. But it's not a big screen. It's not enveloping in the same way. So I think that there's going to be the casual gaming on your phone, and then there's going to be kind of the big events on your computer or your PlayStation or your Xbox, and that's going to be a big split. And it's kind of like what you see in Hollywood. You've got the big budget, what we call the AAA games, and then there's a lot in between. But then a lot of it is kind of what can be done for the mobile side, the sort of the low budget, the indie.
Yeah, the indie. There are platforms now where indie designers can even hop on and distribute smaller games. It won't be like what you're describing and what you've worked on, those great big immersive ones. But I do think that it's important to remember how critical story is, because I think the most successful games are the ones that are going to have strong story and strong character elements.
Yeah, and you asked me at the top, what's the advice I give to writers, and this is for people ask me, what do you give advice for people who want to be game writers? And it's similar, but I say make something interactive, because I was lucky enough that they were looking for a writer. I had sort of the circuitous personal connection to get my foot in the door. And because of what they were doing was very new, there wasn't a lot of examples for, to show people what they wanted, or for people who had made samples of that type of game. So they were willing to read my screenplay samples. But nowadays there's this whole narrative game genre that is pretty well established, and there are tools for people to write, whether it's a program called Twine, there's some others where you can write something that you can play through and click through, and it'll be in text format, but that's making something playable is going to show your skills as somebody who can write for interactive far more than writing something that is linear and doesn't have to take into account the fact that the player gets to play a role in it.
Yeah, right. So do you have any, you touched on it there, but more specific recommendations for people who might be interested in writing for the gaming industry?
I think that it's one, have a gaming sample, have an interactive sample. And then the other is that, it is a difficult time in the games industry right now. There have been over 7,000 layoffs this year.
Really? Why is that? You guys are making major money, aren't you?
I think that it's a contraction after people were stuck at home for a few years, and there was maybe a bit of a bubble, and then there is a contraction going on right now.
I see.
And then there's also just a cyclical nature to it, where there were a lot of big games this year, and I think that when a big game comes out, studios tend to contract after that as well, because they don't need to carry as much staff as they start kind of the next project. So, but that said, unlike, say, writing for film and television, writing jobs in games are put on LinkedIn and job sites. They have websites that say, "Hey, we're hiring for an open role for a junior writer." So there are fewer barriers to actually getting into the industry than there are, say, wanting to write for Marvel movies. That's a little bit more of a closed system.
Right. Well, this has just been a fascinating talk.
Very cool.
But I should probably wrap. Let me ask you one more question.
Okay.
What are you working on? I'm not sure if I should say now or next, but to the extent that you can talk about it, what's in the future?
Well, right now I'm working on some linear spec projects rather than games. When I have kind of my fill of writing interactive when I'm on a job like Star Trek that takes several years of your brain being kind of pulled like taffy through all these different directions. And so I'm working on some linear projects that are a little bit more straightforward, where the main character can surprise you at times, because in games it's the player that surprises you more than the character. You want to let the player do that kind of that decision making, rather than taking it away from them. So sometimes it's nice in a way for me to be the player, and for me to be able to write something where I get to make all the calls.
Right. I get that. That makes wait, does this mean there won't be a Resurgence 2?
I didn't say that. We all hope that the crew of the USS Resolute. We hope that the USS Resolute gets more missions, and to see, and whether it's in a game format, or like I said, we did a prequel comic for the game as well with IDW Publishing, and that was fun, because you go from having 1,400 pages and it's very dialogue driven to something where you want to just feature the art. You want to keep the words as kind of spare as possible, so people can look at the art. So there's more life out there for Captain Rydek and the rest of the crew.
That's fabulous. Dan, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Just a few parting words, Lara. You've got a Christmas novel, don't you?
do. The Wallum Files Christmas Spirit, and it is currently on sale for 99 cents. Can't beat that.
Go ahead. No, you can't beat that. And well,
No.
now I'm embarrassed to hold up a book that costs a whopping, I think, $1.99 on ebook because it's discounted for Christmas. I tried to hang this on the tree behind me, but that just didn't work. So
No.
Christmas Tapestry is a lovely anthology, and I've got a story in it, and so do some other terrific writers. All of them Christmas stories, but all of them different. You know, it's not all romances or all mysteries or whatever. It's a tapestry. And that's what I liked about it. And let me also say, WriterCon has a magazine, and you don't want to miss the holiday issue, which comes out tomorrow as this podcast is released. And it's all about writing and advice for writers and help for writers. But this time it all has a holiday theme. So
this issue is like a warm cup of hot cocoa.
Oh, that's so much better. But instead of cocoa being in it, there are articles about how to write a Christmas story. And what else? Help me out here.
How to market during the holiday
marketing
season.
During the holiday seasons,
what
which
kind
is
of
different.
gifts to give your writing friends, and also what kind of gifts to give you, as well as some humorous pieces, some inspirational pieces, and an interview with Santa.
Oh, can't turn that down.
Yeah.
So that's WriterCon magazine. And to subscribe, just go to Substack. That's SUBSTACK, and look for WriterCon, WRITERCON. And that's how you get the magazine. There are free subscriptions, which allow you to read the post, and of course the paid subscription that allows you to actually get the magazine. And that's what you want, right? All right. Until next time, keep writing. And remember, you cannot fail if you refuse to quit. See you next time.